Hello, welcome to Aston Original. Today we're talking pitch invasions. There have been a number of pitch invasions after games in England in recent weeks, with instances of supporters attacking players. A fan was jailed after headbutting Sheffield United captain Billy Sharp. Aston Villa keeper Robin Olsen was assaulted at Manchester City. Crystal Palace boss Patrick Vieira was also involved in an altercation with an Everton supporter during a pitch invasion following his side's Premier League defeats at Goodison Park. And Swindon Town players were physically and verbally abused after their League Two playoff semi-final defeat at Port Vale. I'm joined today by Danny Fitzpatrick. Welcome back to the channel, Danny. To begin with, how concerned are you that these pitch invasions are happening and are occurring more and more, it seems?
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I think there's two things to distinguish, and that's the kind of the pitch invasions in general, which are relatively rare in the course of the season, but are not kind of unforeseeable. You know, we do tend to have pitch invasions quite a bit, around the end of the season, because it coincides with the end of the season, climactic, decisive games. So I think there's two debates to be had. One about pitch invasions in general, and then the more isolated incidents of violence and abuse that have occurred in the context of those pitch invasions, which is much more unusual and is obviously much more concerning. So I think it's important not to conflate those two things. They're exactly the same thing. They're obviously related, but they are different. So I think, obviously, the incidents, both are criminal acts, but the incidents of violence and abuse is much more concerning because it is a threat to player safety and also to the safety of other people who are working in and around the stadia. It's not just the players. So it's also the stewards, the other match day officials, managers, and so on and so forth. So that is obviously a worrying concern. My main concern, notwithstanding that kind of threat, is that the whole debate doesn't get swept up in a moral panic, because generally good policy is not made in those circumstances where kind of tensions are elevated, and we could get changes or new policies introduced which are poorly evidence-based. So I think that it's always important to kind of step back from the immediacy of these events and actually analyse what will work and what is practical and what is feasible.
We don't want to go back to a time where we're almost caging fans in. We talk about it's taking a step back potentially, but we don't want to go backwards in time, as it were. Gareth Southgate has come out recently and sort of said it seems to be more to do with the mood of the country at the moment rather than anything else. Would you agree with the England manager?
I think that was it was an interesting remark that Southgate made. I would be in broad agreement with him. I think one of the explanations for why this recent spate of pitch evasions, and in particular the kind of the more violent incidents are happening, is to do with the so-called post-pandemic effect. And maybe there's a kind of a yearning for some fans to return to a more, let's say, traditional, kind of carnivalesque, more transgressive terrace culture. I think there's part of it is also on behalf of younger fans who have not been perhaps socialised to the extent in, let's say, the established boundaries of kind of fan behaviour because of the lockdown. But I think it does link to an actual sociological theory about sport. So there was a famous study, one of the earliest scholarly pieces of research done on sport, was by two authors, Norbert Elias and Eric Dunning. And to kind of put it very briefly, they looked at what the role of sport in civilized society. And for Elias and Dunning, one of the things they argued is that sport offers an outlet in a civilized society where the normal rules of kind of social etiquette and manners are relaxed. And that's important to fulfill that role. But they also talked about what they call decivilizing spurts, when actually manners and etiquette and behaviour would regress. And I think that does link to what Gareth Southgate's saying. I think part of the, if you think about the last 2 years of the pandemic, the external constraints on behaviour have been very evident to people. People have been literally told what they can and can't do, to an almost unprecedented extent. And maybe those internal restraints around etiquette have receded or eroded a little bit. And maybe we're kind of seeing some of the results of that. Because it's not just football as well. Obviously football gets the main focus because it's the kind of the biggest sport and the most mediatized sport. But similar increases in disorder have also been reported in other sports, particularly rugby league, since the pandemic. So yeah, maybe Southgate is on something, and it does have kind of some basis in sociological theory as well.
Very, very interesting stuff to link it to that. A lot of the time, the clubs will say, that these are isolated incidents where one bad apple is the problem, but it could go a little bit wider than that. I think the thing that probably shocked me and myself as a football fan is that the caliber of the games where this is happening. I don't know if you would agree, where someone like Manchester City winning a fourth title in 5 years, they should be used to doing it by now. But I don't think there were pitch invasions when Aguero scored that goal against QPR, and to see the Nottingham Forest fan headbutts Billy Sharp, who used to play for Nottingham Forest, and this is a game that sees them go into a playoff final in the Championship. This isn't even winning promotion to the Premier League. Is it just mindless idiots in that sense?
Yeah, I think the Billy Sharp incident was particularly shocking. It was the kind of the worst example of what's happened in the last kind of couple of weeks, and that did really shock me. I'd not really seen that before. The other comments about the caliber of games, I think we need to remember again, they are rare but not novel events. So I actually thought, I was the same as you. I thought there wasn't a pitch invasion, 10 years ago in the Aguero goal. But actually, when I went back to watch it, there was a pitch invasion at the end.
Oh, was there? I didn't even.
There was. So I thought it would make it an interesting direct comparison of why wasn't the one 10 years ago and there was one this year. But there was 10 years ago. So they're rare, but they are kind of common features of our game. And I think football's got a problem and the sports media has got a problem because they are part, whether right or wrong, they do become part of football folklore, particularly in this country. We only need to think about, the 66 Cup final, the words of Kenneth Wolstenholme, Ronnie Radford. All these events are part of the fabric of football. And to a large extent are celebrated, but they are kind of decried within the kind of, within the present context. So it's a difficult one. I think it's a difficult one to manage. I think what is not helpful is kind of sometimes the knee-jerk responses that we get in the media, and particularly from ex-players, because ex-players obviously, and current players to a certain extent, they're obviously an important constituency and they should have a voice, but they give a particular perspective, and it's not always the most rational or the most level-headed one. I think actually this time there has been a little bit more of a measured response. A few years ago, there was another spate of pitch invasions, and quite violent ones, in 2019, which again maybe puts the whole post-pandemic kind of explanation into doubt a little bit. And the response to that one was much more emotional and frankly irrational, where there was call for kind of armed guards and to shoot spectators supposedly when they come onto the pitch, and that's not good, because I think what's needed is a recognition of the level of risk. And it's an absolute empirical fact that if we look at football post-war, British football post-war, there's over 250 fans have died in various different stadia disasters. The number of violent incidents inflicted on players is minuscule in comparison, both in number and significance. So the idea that even an option or a threat to return of perimeter offences shouldn't even be, in my opinion, within the debate. That so it, and I know it's not really looked at as an option, but it shouldn't even come up in this kind of discourse on what should be done. And I think that always needs to be kind of bared in mind.
One of the points you made, Danny, was that social media is also playing quite a large part in why this is potentially happening, and maybe fueling what it would mean to be a real fan, an authentic fan, and potentially running on the pitch would tick one of those boxes for a lot of people. When they do see those videos inevitably on TikTok or Twitter or wherever it is of just, wobbly camera, poor picture quality, but they're clearly on the pitch.
Yeah, so I think you can see from the images, you can see lots of fans, holding the phones, filming while they're running on the pitch, filming, their interactions with players, both positive and negative. So I think there's a desire, as I say, for that individual fan to be one of the protagonists and, to kind of make the most of that. But yeah, I think collectively as well, perhaps fans don't want to be seen as inauthentic or, to use the vernacular, kind of plastic fans who kind of stand there, kind of politely clapping. So I think there's a desire to be seen, to be authentic, to kind of have the biggest celebration, the most outlandish, the kind of the wildest celebrations. But yeah, so I think social media is certainly a factor, and you can see it, right down the football pyramid into non-league. So, particularly some non-league matches or even amateur games. I've seen pitch invasions in the National Amateur Cup this year. They can achieve a level of notoriety because of what the fans do, above and beyond what that kind of the attention that would normally receive for a game. So I think that desire to be seen, to be authentic, is definitely one of the drivers. I think of why we're seeing a succession or a spate of pitch invasions,
because it's more infamy than anything else, and the doing it, but being remembered for.
You can see on Twitter. There's a number of different Twitter accounts. Football away days. I think Football Limbs one's called.
Yeah, I've seen.
The purpose is to show fan celebrations. Yeah. So fans, perhaps more than ever, or certainly for a long time, they're part of the conversation on contemporary football, and it's for those expressions of fan culture, whether that be the use of pyrotechnics or how wildly they celebrate, or in this case pitch invasions. It's all part of that conversation. So that is definitely, I think, now firmly part of fan psyche and fan culture. And how that plays out in social media, I think, is really important. So to ignore that in, what has been happening recently, I think is wrong. So that definitely needs to be kind of factored in and thought about.
This is probably a question I probably should have asked at the beginning. But have you ever been on a pitch? Have you ever invaded a pitch?
I've Everton stayed up against Wimbledon, and I don't want to incriminate myself and my father. 1994, Everton stayed up against Wimbledon, the last game of the season, and my father actually instructed me to get on the pitch. So yes, it have, and I was there last. So I'm an Everton supporter. I was there last Thursday against Crystal Palace, and one thing, and this is kind of it's a small point, and it might be irrelevant, but I think this is purely anecdotal, so there's no empirical basis for this point I'm going to make. But in any explanation of football, let's say football disorder or football hooliganism, the overriding masculinity of that phenomena is often highlighted, and I think that's absolutely true. And it's that so-called kind of a culture of toxic masculinity. Mm-hmm. And one thing I did notice last week at the pitch invasion at Goodison Park was it did represent a cross-section of fans. So I saw men, women and children of all ages. I saw disabled supporters on the pitch. There's actually lots of people may have seen the video which is circulating on social media of the Man City supporter who took his granddad to the game against Aston Villa, and his granddad suffered from dementia, and it was a story of their day. And the granddad ends up on the pitch. So, in some ways, maybe that reflects the progress that football's made. If pitch invasions are becoming more inclusive, maybe that's a slightly kind of positive spin to put on things. But I do think, it wasn't exclusively male. We might argue that everyone is kind of suffering from a sense of, some of the worst features of masculinity, but at least in terms of who was there and who was represented, it was a relatively broad cross-section of the fan base. I think it is worth noting.
I think, and just for full disclosure, I've also been on a pitch. It was what would have been 2008, 2009, something like that. I think where Wolves won promotion to the Premier League, winning the league, and on the pitch at the end. So, but that had a lot of people in. I can remember another promotion where that absolutely didn't happen, mostly because there was a trophy presentation at the end of it. So you're just ruining the moment that you've been waiting all season for. But I can see why you might be more inclined when the prize isn't a tangible thing; it's being in the league next season rather than lifting any silverware. But no, some really interesting points in there. I mean, the final question was around a regulator, and does it highlight calls for a proper regulation within the Premier League? Whenever we talk about regulator, we're probably talking about finances a lot of the time, and some of the other stuff that is absolutely as important probably does go by the wayside. But does it raise arguments for it a little bit further? Because obviously, you're big into what happened with the fan-led review and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're well versed on the topic.
Well, there is actually a regulator there is already a regulator for, let's say, the health and safety of football stadia, the Sports Ground Safety Authority. I don't think there's calls to replace that particular regulator, but I think within the debate on the fan-led review of governance, I think it is relevant in the sense that the football supporters, maybe with the exception of airports in the kind of post 9/11 era, nowhere is space and people more regulated than football stadia and surveilled more than football stadia. So the issues of pitch invasions are not the result of under-regulation. So I don't think more regulation is needed. There can obviously be tweaks to how the crowd is managed, definitely. But I think it does link to the lack of engagement with football supporters. I think if football supporters and football supporters groups are engaged and consulted more in crowd control and crowd management, that would be a positive step. Because I think, going back to why do fans do it? Why do fans invade the pitch? And I think one of the reasons is they want to feel like they are participating. At those points, fans change from a willingness to be a spectator to the need or the want to be a protagonist, to be literally on the same level as players and managers. So, and I think all the safety experts, all the football safety officers over the last week have said it's impossible. It's impossible to actually stop a critical mass of fans entering the pitch when they want to. And you can't police that entirely. So if we're not going to return to perimeter fences, which is out of the question, then dialogue and engagement is needed. And I think that's where a new regulator could facilitate that dialogue, engagement and consultation, which would hopefully lead to kind of better policy and kind of better safety precautions, both for the players and other kind of people within that workplace and the fans.
Very interesting point in there, especially with the psychology of wanting to be on literally the same level and a piece of the action in that sense, but also the fact that stadiums are the most surveilled places, and that there has to be a deeper reason to thinking that people will get away with it, because it's just not the case, is it? Because the likelihood is that there is going to be a camera on you, or someone will be filming it, and the chances of getting away with it, quotation marks, is very, very slim, isn't it? So very, very interesting stuff. Danny, if people want to have a chat to you about that experience in the 90s, or they want to reminisce, they could potentially do it over Twitter. You're quite active on Twitter. What's your handle?
My handle is @dfitzpolitics.
Perfect.
_politics, I should say.
_politics, that's it. And I'll drop it in the description of the video as well. But we'll say thanks to Danny Fitzpatrick. Danny, thank you for coming on again and just making it a little bit more clearer, because I'm sure people listening to this will go, I actually never thought of that.
No, cheers, Sam. Really enjoyed speaking to you.